At 61 years old, Odessa Fairweather stood in the dust of a courthouse yard in the Wyoming Territory with $11 sewn into her hem and nowhere left to sleep that night. Her brother-in-law, Thomas Vance, had seen to that he had stood before the county judge not 2 hours earlier and testified, with a steadiness that still curdled her stomach to remember, that Odessa was too old, too adult, and too much a woman to hold the deed her late husband had left her. The judge, weary and unwilling to fight a room full of ranchers who agreed with Thomas, had signed the transfer without once looking Odessa in the eye. She had walked out of that courthouse with her husband's name still on her tongue and nothing else in her hands. All she owned in the world was $11, a coat too thin for the coming autumn, and a small tin box of seed she had saved from her own garden, out of some stubborn instinct that a woman ought never travel without something that might grow. It was in that condition, hollowed out, laughed at, dismissed, that she heard of a burned-out, debt-ridden, spread 20 miles west, called Widow's Table, sold at auction for $4, because no one else would touch a ranch, folks said was cursed. She bought it. The men in town called it the last foolish act of a foolish old woman. They did not know that beneath the collapsed floor of that ranch house lay a secret that would not only restore Odessa's name, but would settle a debt the whole town of Prescott Hollow owed to a family it had wronged 40 years before. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Odessa Fairweather. If you have ever been told you were too old, too late, or too much of something to be trusted with what was rightfully yours, tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know we're not alone in this. Odessa had not always been a woman easily dismissed. She was raised on the eastern edge of the Nebraska plains, the second of 4 daughters to a German immigrant father, Henrik Voss, who broke sod with his bare hands rather than borrow money he could not repay, and a mother, Ruth, who kept a garden so orderly and so bountiful that neighbors rode for miles to trade for her seed corn and her cures. It was from her mother that Odessa learned the quiet, unglamorous science of land, how to read soil by its smell and its grain, how to know when a creek would run dry 2 seasons before it did, how to nurse a sick calf back from the edge with nothing but patience and warm mash. Her father taught her different lessons: how to read a ledger, how to argue a fair price without raising her voice, how to recognize the particular silence of a man who was lying to her. A woman who understands numbers, he told her once, mending a harness by lamplight, will never be poor for long, even if she is poor for a while. Odessa had believed him. She had married young, at 19, to a quiet, steady man named Elias Fairweather, a cattleman from the Wyoming Territory who had come through Nebraska buying breeding stock and stayed 3 weeks longer than his business required because he could not stop finding reasons to speak with her. They built Widow's Table together, though it was not yet called that on a stretch of high grass country west of Prescott Hollow, naming it instead the Fairweather Range. And for 18 years they ran cattle, raised 2 children who did not survive past infancy, buried them together beneath a cottonwood on the eastern ridge, and grew into the kind of quiet partnership that does not announce itself but simply endures. Elias trusted Odessa's judgment on breeding, on grazing rotation, on which hands to hire and which to let go, more than he trusted his own, and it was widely known in Prescott Hollow, if quietly resented by some, that the Fairweather Range prospered because of the woman as much as the man. Elias's younger brother, Thomas, had never forgiven either of them for that arrangement. Thomas had wanted the ranch himself since he was a young man, believing it his due as the elder male line, and he had watched for 20 years as his brother deferred to a wife instead of to him, nursing a resentment that would only ripen when the opportunity finally came to act on it. When Elias died of a fever in the spring of Odessa's 59th year, he left the ranch to her outright, in a will witnessed and filed properly at the county seat, but wills, Odessa would learn, are only as strong as the men willing to defend them, and in Prescott Hollow, in that particular year, there were not enough such men. The fall came slowly, the way a fence comes down not all at once, but post by post, until one day there is simply no fence at all. Thomas began by questioning small things, a grazing lease here, a water right there, planting doubt among the neighboring ranchers about whether a widow alone could keep the operation solvent. Then came the winter of the Great Die-Off, when a blizzard out of the Bighorns killed nearly a third of the territory's cattle, Odessa's herd included, and she was forced to borrow against the ranch to survive the following season, a debt she fully intended and was fully capable of repaying. Thomas took that debt and made it his weapon. He went quietly to the banker, a cautious man named Elmer Cassidy who owed Thomas a favor from years past, and convinced him that a woman managing a debt-laden ranch alone was an unacceptable risk, that the bank's note would be safer called in and the property reassigned to a responsible male relation. He gathered affidavits from ranchers who found it easier to side with Thomas than to defend a widow with no husband left to vouch for her temper or her competence. By the time Odessa understood the shape of what was happening, it was already a wave breaking over her, and she spent the last of her savings on a lawyer who told her, not unkindly, that in this territory, in this year, the law's sympathy did not extend far enough to save her. The judge's ruling took the ranch, the herd that remained, the house, and every tool in it. Thomas did not even have the decency to let her gather her mother's seed jars from the pantry shelf. She had smuggled the tin box out beneath her shawl the week before the ruling, sensing what was coming, and it was nearly all she had left of 18 years of building something with her own hands. She spent 3 nights in the back room of the Prescott Hollow boarding house, kept there out of pity by the innkeeper's wife, before she heard the men in the saloon laughing about Widow's Table, the cursed, half-burned ranch out past Coyote Creek that nobody would touch, even at auction, going for a price so low it was an insult to call it a sale. She rode out to see it the next morning, on a borrowed mule, with her $11 and her tin of seed and nothing to lose that had not already been taken from her. Widow's Table earned its grim name honestly. The previous owner, a solitary rancher named Josiah Redd, had died in a house fire 11 years before, under circumstances the county had never fully explained, and the land had passed through 3 owners since, each abandoning it within a season, claiming bad luck, strange sounds in the night, cattle that would not graze past the eastern fence line. The house itself was a half-collapsed shell, one wing burned to its foundation, the other still standing but sagging, its windows blind with dust. The barn had fared better, though its roof had caved in one corner, and the land, 600 acres of high grass, a good creek, a defensible rise for a homestead was, Odessa saw immediately, wasted. Not cursed, wasted. She paid her $4 to the county clerk that same afternoon, watched him try to hide his amusement as he stamped the deed, and rode back out to what was now, against every reasonable expectation, hers. The men of Prescott Hollow began calling her the fool of Coyote Creek within the week. She did not much mind. She had been called worse things by people who mattered more to her. Her first weeks at Widow's Table were spent simply making one room livable, and it was in clearing the debris of the burned wing, hauling out charred timber and broken crockery, that Odessa found the first thread of what would unravel into something far larger than she expected. Beneath a fallen section of the parlor floor, protected from the fire by a slab of hearthstone that had collapsed downward instead of burning through, she found a section of floorboard that did not sit flush with the others, its edge worn smooth in a way that suggested it had been lifted and replaced many times. Prying it up with a fire iron, she found a shallow cavity, and within it, wrapped in oilcloth, gone brittle but intact, a leather ledger book, its pages foxed but legible, and a small bundle of letters tied with twine. The ledger bore the name Josiah Redd on its flyleaf, and its early pages were the ordinary record of a modest ranch's business cattle counts, feed purchases, wages paid to hands whose names meant nothing to her. But as she read further, by lamplight, night after night, the entries changed in character, becoming less a record of commerce and more a record of conscience. Josiah Redd, it seemed, had spent the last years of his life documenting something he called the Hollow's debt, and the letters, written in a hand both careful and increasingly urgent, were addressed to a lawyer in Cheyenne and never sent. The deepening of the mystery came slowly, the way real truths do, refusing to arrive all at once. Piecing together the ledger's later entries and the unsent letters, Odessa learned that Josiah Redd had not always ranched alone. 40 years before, The land now called Widow's Table had belonged not to a single homesteader but to a small community of freedmen and their families, formerly enslaved people who had come west after the war seeking exactly what the Homestead Act had promised them, land of their own, held under a claim properly filed at the territorial office, a settlement they had named Liberty Creek. Josiah Redd, then a young surveyor working for the territorial land office, had been present when a coalition of Prescott Hollow's founding ranchers, Thomas Vance's own father chief among them, had conspired to have Liberty Creek's claim invalidated on a technicality. A supposed filing error that Josiah's own ledger revealed had been deliberately fabricated, forged into the record by a corrupt clerk paid in cattle. The families of Liberty Creek had been driven off the land they had legally earned, their homes burned or dismantled, their claim erased from the county's official history so thoroughly that most of Prescott Hollow's current residents had never even heard the name. Josiah Redd, alone among the men involved, had been unable to live comfortably with what he'd helped enable through his silence, and he had spent his later years quietly trying to locate the descendants of Liberty Creek's families, recording names, last known destinations, and most remarkably, a map, carefully drawn and annotated, showing where a portion of Liberty Creek's original settlers had buried a small strongbox of savings and heirlooms before their forced departure, in the hope of one day returning to reclaim both the land and what they'd hidden. Josiah had never finished his restitution. The fire that killed him, Odessa now suspected from a final, trembling entry in the ledger, dated mere days before his death, had not been the accident the county recorded, but the work of men who feared what his conscience might finally compel him to reveal. Odessa sat with that knowledge for the better part of a week, understanding with a cold clarity that she now possessed something far more dangerous than a deed to unwanted land. She possessed the true history of Prescott Hollow's founding families, and evidence that the wealth and standing of men like Thomas Vance's own father had been built in part on a theft the entire town had agreed, through silence, to forget. She could have used it differently. She could have quietly located Liberty Creek's buried strongbox, kept whatever wealth it held, and said nothing to anyone, and no one would have faulted her, given all that had been taken from her. But Odessa had been raised by a mother who taught her that land carries memory whether or not people choose to remember it, and she found she could not sit on a truth this large without trying to make it right. The conflict arrived exactly as she expected it would. Word travels in small territories, and when Odessa began quietly asking after old land office records at the Cheyenne Territorial Archive, and inquiring by letter after any surviving Red family or Liberty Creek descendants, Thomas Vance heard of it within a month, through the same network of favors and loyalties that had cost her the ranch in the first place. He rode out to Widow's Table himself, the first time he had bothered to acknowledge her existence since the courthouse, and he did not bother with pleasantries. He told her plainly that whatever she thought she had found in that burned house was better left buried, that dredging up old business would serve no one, least of all a worn-out widow, with nothing better to occupy her. When threats failed, as advice failed to move her, he tried other means. He leaned on the banker Cassidy again to call in a note Odessa had taken out for seed and lumber, hoping to force her off the land before she could finish her inquiries. He spread word through Prescott Hollow that the fool of Coyote Creek had gone from foolish to dangerous, stirring up old grudges that respectable people preferred left alone. He even attempted, through an intermediary, to buy the ledger from her outright, offering a sum that would have solved every practical problem she had, if only she would burn the pages and forget she'd ever found them. Odessa refused every offer, weathered every threat, and kept working, because she had learned something in her years running cattle with Elias that Thomas had never learned in his years of wanting what wasn't his. That patience, properly applied, outlasts intimidation every time. Her patience found its answer sooner than she expected, in the person of a school teacher's letter forwarded from Cheyenne, a woman named Adeline Marsh, granddaughter of one of Liberty Creek's original families. The Marshes, who had resettled in Colorado after their expulsion and had spent decades quietly passing down the story of the land they'd lost, never able to prove it, never able to locate it, but never willing to let their children forget the name Liberty Creek either. Adeline arrived at Widow's Table, 3 weeks after her letter, traveling by rail and wagon with her elderly father, Cornelius Marsh, who had been a boy of 9 when his family was driven from the land Odessa now stood on, and who wept, silently and without shame, when Odessa showed him Josiah Redd's map and led him to the exact rise above the creek where the strongbox had been hidden. What they found there, once dug free of 40 years of soil, was not a fortune in the way Thomas Vance might have imagined one, a modest collection of coin, a set of silver spoons, a Bible with names recorded in a careful hand, a deed to the original Liberty Creek claim itself, still legally valid, its forged invalidation now provably fraudulent, according to Josiah Redd's own testimony and the corroborating records Odessa had gathered in Cheyenne. It was, in every way that mattered, proof. The climax came at the Prescott Hollow County Courthouse, the very building where Odessa had lost everything 2 years before, and where she now stood beside Cornelius and Adeline Marsh to present the evidence of Liberty Creek's original, legitimate, and fraudulently invalidated claim. Thomas Vance fought it, as everyone expected he would, hiring the territory's sharpest lawyer to argue that decades had passed, that no court could unwind history so old that the Marsh family's claim, however sympathetically presented, had no standing after 40 years of silence. But Odessa had not come only with sentiment. She had come with Josiah Redd's ledger, with the forged filing exposed by comparison to the land office's own untampered records in Cheyenne, with sworn statements gathered from 2 elderly Prescott Hollow residents who remembered, when finally asked directly, fragments of the truth they had spent a lifetime not saying aloud. The judge who heard the case was not the same weary man who had stripped Odessa of her ranch, and he did not share that judge's willingness to let convenience stand in for justice. The ruling restored the original Liberty Creek claim to Cornelius Marsh and his descendants, a parcel of land adjoining Odessa's own that had, in the intervening decades, been quietly absorbed into Prescott Hollow's common grazing land that Thomas Vance's family had profited from for 2 generations without ever holding rightful title to it. Thomas's public humiliation was thorough, and, to Odessa's mind, entirely of his own making. The same court records that restored Liberty Creek's claim also laid bare, in cold legal language, the fabricated affidavits and called-in favors Thomas had used to strip Odessa of widow's table. And while the court's remedy for that older injustice was limited, the town's opinion of Thomas Vance was not. Men who had once sided with him at the saloon now crossed the street rather than be seen deferring to him. Banker Cassidy, eager to distance himself from the scandal, quietly extended Odessa a note on generous terms, an apology dressed as commerce. Thomas Vance did not go to prison. He did not need to. He simply became, in the eyes of the only community that had ever mattered to him, exactly what he had once called Odessa, a person whose word could no longer be trusted with anything of consequence. And so we return to where we began, to a woman of 61, standing in a courthouse yard with $11 and no home, buying $4 worth of ruin because no one had left her anything better to buy. They said Odessa Fairweather could not run a ranch. They said it plainly, in courtrooms and saloons, in the careless certainty of men who had never once had to prove they belonged to the land beneath their own feet. What none of them accounted for was that a woman dismissed as too old and too foolish to hold a deed might also be the one person patient enough and honest enough to uncover a truth the whole town had spent 40 years too comfortable to face. Odessa did not restore Widow's Table for herself alone. She restored it, and Liberty Creek alongside it, because she understood something her mother had tried to teach her long ago in a Nebraska garden. That land remembers what is done to it, and that the people willing to listen to that memory are rarely the ones anyone expects. Thank you for spending this time with Odessa and the quiet, hard-won justice of Widow's Table. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs to hear that being overlooked is not the same as being without worth. We'd love to know what is a time you found value in something others had already written off. Tell us in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.